That means, so we got here books as Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewry from the Golden Age of Spain to modern times, edited by Sion Sohar. All right, now a little further down, I want to get into the Sephardic civilization began long before the Reconquista, in a time when the peninsula was ruled by Muslims and when Arabic culture surrounded and influenced the Jews. What? Arabic culture influenced the Jews. Sephardic society in the medieval Arab world was characterized by several features: its sense of noble descent, its tradition of service to Gentile rulers, its tradition of service to Gentile rulers. Why were they doing that? Its high cultural achievement in philosophy and poetry, and its history of crypto Judaism, secret Judaism, the secret continued practice of Judaism after apparent conversions under duress. If you don't understand what they're saying, is a lot of these Sephardic Jews and even Muslim Moors, they had to secretly, practice their religion, but they had to openly admit to be Christians. So they were labeled Christians, but they weren't. They were crypto Jews or Moriscos, crypto Muslims. Conventional wisdom has traditionally held that medieval Jews living in the Arab world enjoyed substantially greater security and higher level of political and cultural integration than Jews living under the cross did. All right. During this time, Sephardic Jews were living good under Muslim rule, under Arab rule. All right. I'm in this book. Real quick to correlate, says Farewell España, the world of the Sephardim remembered, by Howard M. Sakar. Sephardim. Again, Farewell España, the world of Sephardim remembered. All right, Separd. All right, so it's talking about the Andalusia in Cordoba city after the conquest of the Moors. And it says here that it was a city, a realm that proved uniquely congenial to its Jews, dispersed in small enclaves throughout the southern and central regions of the peninsula. These Jews of Sepharad, the Hebrew term for Iberia, openly welcomed their new conquerors. What? They openly what? They openly welcomed their conquerors, the Moors. They helped them. Yet earlier, under the Christian Visigoths, the Sephardim, remember who the Visigoths, the Goths, the Sumerians, the Goths, they're the same people of the Japhetic tribes. The Sephardim had endured harsh conversionary pressures and intermittent physical abuse. Now they were quite prepared to offer their services to the invaded Moors. Who's offering their services? Sephardic Jews, even to organize their own Jewish militias for battle against the common enemy. It was useful commitment from the 8th century onward, ruled by the far-sighted Abd al-Rahman and his heirs. The Umayyad Caliphate was preoccupied far less with religious orthodoxy than with economic prosperity. To be sure, the Jewish and Christian populations were to be regarded as dhimmis under Islamic law, that is, as non-heathen, but still essentially second-class citizens. They're not heathens, but they're second-class citizens. As such, they were subjected to criminatory poll taxes, to residential and vocational restrictions, to social discrimination, even to demeaning badges of personal identification. In consequence, the royal administration have learned to trust the Jews, even as consigned them to their own residential quarters in Cordoba, Seville, and other captured cities. It ensures that they were decently accommodated as a rule, within sighted under the protection of the royal palace. Right? These Jews were being protected by the Moors, all right, and suffered no limitations on their freedom of movement or economic activity. The arrangement was productive enough to attract Jews from other lands. During the 8th and 9th centuries, several thousand Moroccan and Egyptian Jews joined the far larger numbers of Muslim Berbers who migrated to Andalusia. Few were disappointed. In contrast to their circumstances in Christian Europe, where they were limited essentially to mercantile activities, mercantile Jews in Spain were allowed a far more diversified socio-economic base. Some acquired modest plots of land and cultivated orchards and vineyards. Many others became leather workers, tanners, dyers, jewelers, and silversmiths. To this day, former Jewish neighborhoods in Cordoba, Seville, Zaragoza, Malaga, and other southern Spanish cities bear such names as Plaza of the tanners, street of the dyers, lane of the shoemakers, of Alcaecería de los Judíos, silk market of the Jews. Above all, the Sephardim were heavyweight merchants. Who? The Sephardim, the Sephardians, who was merchants as well, the Sumerians, right? We're going to learn about the Radanites, all right? What do they have to do? Why they are so involved in merchant and trade, right? Remember the Sumerians and these people were also, what was their relation with Danites as well, or Israelite or groups or Hebrew groups, right? These Sumerians. We're going to dig into all this, right? We're going to keep digging. Again, above all, the Sephardim, the Sephardims were heavyweight merchants as the diadem of caliphate that linked the southern Mediterranean world in a network of standardized laws, weights, measures, and currency exchange. Andalusia offered Jews an arena for commerce unparalleled since the glory days of Rome. They set up shop for them to work. They were like, all right, y'all good at this? We're gonna do commerce here. It was unparalleled since the glory days of Rome. Sailing the great Middle Sea, Jewish traders shared amply in the widening traffic. Remember that the Danites were known as the sea people too. All right. In Andalusia itself, they were the premier importers, exporters of silk, leather, textiles, grain, fruit, spices, and cattle, including the human cattle, of slaves, including the what? The human cattle. Who? Sephardi Jews, Sephardim Jews. They were the importers and exporters of slaves from the Balkans and Western Russia, Slavs and Rus people, the Slavs and Rus people. Moreover, Islamic rule in Spain offered the Jews still another boon, one no less precious than physical and economic security. This was communal self-government. Though through a council of their own notables, Jews assessed the tax themselves. Their funds were applied both to the governments and collective dihimi, poll taxes, and to the Jews' own social, health, and educational services. All right, so it goes on and on. I mean, this book says Handbook to Life in the Medieval World, Volume 3, by Madeline Pellner Cosman, Linda Gale Jones. It says here in this part, Sepharad, the Jews of Al-Andalus. It says the Jews who aided the Muslim armies in establishing Islamic rule in the Iberian Peninsula, they aided, again, they helped them, right? Because they had the routes, they had the trade routes, they knew how to help them get in. They controlled the money, they controlled the economy. The Jews who aided the Muslims' armies in establishing Islamic rule in the Iberian Peninsula were rewarded with one of the most lenient and generous manifestations of Dihimi status. Remember, second class. Jews engaged in all manners of occupations from agricultural and viticulture to commerce, trade, medicine, and the crafts. Jews exercised complete authority over their internal affairs and were governed by the Jewish exilarch called Ha-Nazi, the prince in Andalus. All right, I got this in my video Columbus and his Negro friends. If you haven't seen that, go back. All right, how I explain how they used that word. It meant prince of Andalus, and Jewish exilarchs were titled Ha-Nazi, Nazi, a Nazi. I thought that was supposed to be against Jews, but they were actually, as it says here, let me just show you, the most famous Jewish prince in Muslim Spain was powerful Samuel ibn Nagrela, also known as Samuel Ha-Nagrid or Ha-Nazi, the prince. Born at Cordoba in 1993, during his long and tumultuous life, he witnessed the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate in 1031 and himself victim of the political intrigues of the court. All right, again, what do they say? A famous Jewish prince in Muslim Spain. All right, they weren't always at war. These people had a confederation, a coalition, a union. Right? This is the Cambridge Guide to Jewish History, Religion, and Culture, edited by Judith R. Baskin and Kenneth Siskin. The political, ethnic, and social fragmentation of Andalusian society, remember this is in Spain, provided Jews an unparalleled opportunity for government service. A significant class of Jewish courtiers arose who emulated the model of Hasda'i. They included such high-ranking administrators as Jekutiel ibn Hassan in Saragossa, who was the patron of the young poet and philosopher Solomon ibn Gabiro, and Abraham ibn Muhajir in Seville, who bore the titles of vizier at court and Nazi, all right, Nazi in the Jewish community, A Nazi in the what? A Nazi in the what? In the Jewish community. He was praised by leading poets of the period such as Judah Halevi and Moses Ibn Ezra, and the latter dedicated his collection of poems, the Book of the Necklace. All right, so I hope you understand, and it can keep going. They actually were living good in these times, especially if they're in commerce and helping them, get control of this part of the world, Iberia.
All right, just for in case nobody understands or somebody's new here about Kurimeo, who are you talking about? Jews? You talking about Israelites? Who are you talking about? So no, we're actually talking about the Jews and Moors in Spain. Yeah, the Jews and Moors in Spain. Spain, Iberia, right next to Morocco, the Mediterranean, Portugal. All right, this is by Rabbi Jos Kruskov. We're in this is chapter 17, the dispersion of the Jews. Chapter 17, dispersion of the Jews. Thus mournfully closed the last chapter. These are sad words fraught with anguish and despair. Yet however sad, however despondent and hopeless, however much of grief and anguish and despair they convey, they befell the Jews of Spain, and they fell altogether. When they are asked to describe the sufferings and miseries which met the unfortunate exiles everywhere, in their fruitless search for a quiet spot where they might live or die in peace, ships stood ready in the harbors to carry nearly all of the banished 300,000 Jews, whithersoever it suited the captains best. All right, so again, these are moderate numbers because we're talking about they were very prosperous for hundreds of years with the Moors. All right, so we have others, scholars that will question these numbers and talk about millions, right? Now it says here, into these ships, exiles were literally packed, all right, literally packed in ships, crowded together without regard to sex or age, often mother torn from child, husband from wife, brother from sister, friends from friends, and separated on the coast meant separation forever. Words and the heart failed me to speak of the heart-rending cries of parent for child and child for parent, of husband for wife and wife for husband, or of the wailing and lamenting as Spain, the land of their birth, the home of their comfort and luxury and blessings. All right, Spain, not Africa, right? Spain, not Africa, Spain, place of their birth, slowly faded out of sight and finally disappeared beneath the horizon. All right, now you tell me if that don't sound like what happened to Kunta Kinte and the so-called African slave stories, how they were snatching people, separating families, babies from their moms. All right, now we're talking about a real history here. When we're talking about Mr. Plagiarizing Alex Haley, who got sued for plagiarizing a fictional book called The African. But this fictional book most likely was inspired by real events, real history. And we've already shown the indentured servitude system in colonial times and how that worked. We already know a lot of these, and most of these, most likely, majority, were people of color during this time. All right, we're gonna get into this. Oh, Kurimeo, that's just a big thing to say. I mean, how can you prove that? If it talks like a right duck, if it moves like a duck, if it flies like a duck, if it has a color like a duck, then it's a duck, right? Everything is pointing at that. All the sources, all the history. All right, we're gonna continue. All right. So this is further on in the book. When they're put on ships, what they were doing to them when they were putting them in the ships, right? Once they got out of the town, because they were at the mercy of these pirates, so-called pirates or captains or whoever was, you know, and they were known to have supposedly gold and money and all that. You know, whether we can verify this information here, you know, um, most likely we've seen journals of it. A lot of this, we know what these people went through. We know, like, the Huguenots, also a lot of the Protestants, and Sephardic diaspora throughout Europe. But it says here, it says, no sooner were they on high sea when men and women and children were ordered on deck, commanded to disrobe publicly, regardless of innocence of youth and modesty of sex. Many a virgin and many a youth, many a husband and many a wife dared to resist, not that they had money concealed, but for shame's sake. And the raging billows rocked them into their eternal sleep for their resistance. All right, they killed them. Disappointed in their search, their thirst for gold was more excited. Body after body they ripped open, before the eyes of unfortunate exiles, in the belief that they must have swallowed their gold and precious jewels. And disappointed in this, there followed a scene, a more detestable and dastardly one the sun never shone upon. All right, you hear that cruelty going on? These are people of color, right? From Spain. All right, so we're supposed to feel sorry for other, genocides and Holocausts, but it's a lot of the stuff they never tell us about. And, fair use, we're just learning here. Don't take us down. It says, when the sailors had finally satiated their brutal lust upon the innocent and helpless and faint from terror and torture, and when the still surviving victims had been made to cleanse the ships from every trace of the blood of their friends and kin, they were seized and dropped into the ocean without a pang of conscience, and as unconcernedly as if the great God had created Jews for no other purpose but to appease the beastly appetites of inhuman sailors and serve as food for the fishes of the sea. All right? Again, these Catholics are doing this, right? It's a religious warfare. Deep, it's not about complexion. Another captain was somewhat more merciful, whether he had to expiate some of his tender heartedness by humiliating penance, ecclesiastical history has neglected to record. He set all his exiles on the shore upon a desert coast, leaving the weak and the suffering pitilessly a prey to wild beasts and to starvation. One of these unfortunate deserted exiles who survived tells us how he saw his wife perish before his eyes, how he himself fainted with exhaustion, and upon awakening beheld his two children dead by his side. For weeks, roots and grass furnished their food. Each day brought fresh miseries and fresh graves. These were days such as Shakespeare speaks of. Each new morning, new windows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strive heaven on the face. It says, mothers unable to bear the pinning of their children struck them dead. All right? I know a lot of you read scripture. Hey, I don't know if this is sounding familiar. So mothers unable to bear the pinning of their children struck them dead and then took their own life. Whole families folded themselves in love and embrace, and while thus embracing, ended their life with their own hand. When the wind beast came upon them, the exiles plunged into the sea and stood shivering in the water for hours and hours until the beast retreated. Warily they made their way onward until at last they beheld the joyous sight of human settlements. Exhausted they lay along the coast, wasted by suffering and disease, and half demented from starvation. Down to the shore came the priest, and holding a crucifix in one hand and provisions in the other, the unfortunate Jews were given the choice between Christ and starvation. So you choose Christ or you die. Convert or die. That's the Inquisition. Another shipload was cast out by a barbarous captain upon the African coast. So listen to this. People, Sephardic Jews being brought to African coast, right? Are reversed, where the African savages pounced down upon them and abandoned themselves to fight for cruelties. You heard what happened when they dumped them in Africa? West Africa, where they're supposed to, a lot of these Hebrew Israelite camps, attacking me, telling me, oh, they're coming from what, it's actually in reverse a lot of this time. A lot of those were Sephardic Jews that were being taken as slaves or just servants or just being dumped in West Africa. The men and Jews they sold into slavery. The defenseless women were brutally ravished. You know what that means. The children at their mother's breasts, the aged and the sick and the infirm were mutilated and tortured and murdered by the thousands. That's on the African coast. Another shipload landed in the harbor of Genoa, all right, Italy. A graphic picture of their suffering is given by Genoese historian and eyewitness of the scenes, which he describes as follows. No one says he could behold the sufferings of the Jewish exiles unmoved. A great many perished of hunger, especially those of tender years. Mothers with scarcely enough strength to support themselves carried their famished infants in their arms and died with them. Many fell victims to the cold, others to intense thirst, while the unaccustomed distress incident to a sea voyage aggravated their maladies. All right. It says here many of the Portuguese Jews settled and became prosperous in the Indies, in southern France, and in Hamburg. All right. So now we're getting into, all right. So I was reading this just so you guys can get a little, you know, I know we just read sometimes, the Jews and Moors got expelled, but we're not really thinking of all the stuff that's going on in between. And a lot of this stuff happened, and it didn't just happen in a fictional story, how they told us growing up. It was actually happening to real people, and also people of color. So I believe we should care, doesn't matter, people are people, a lot of these people. That's why it was easier for them to come to the Americas, and they were being oppressed, a lot of them. So, they hooked up with Indians, who are also being oppressed, So that's the whole point of this. You can understand, that a lot of the history they tell us is like actually real. Is just told to us in a different way. They steal the narrative and, just change it up, change locations, paper genocide, and then we got so-called history. It says here, many of the Portuguese Jews settled and became prosperous in the Indies, in southern France. All right, southern France. All right, Huguenot and Hamburg. Others settled in the Netherlands. All right, New Jerusalem. All right, Amsterdam, and became especially prosperous in Holland. From Holland, large numbers of the descendants of the Portuguese and Spanish exiles entered England. All right, so Holland, Netherlands, the Dutch, right? These Dutch captains and ships and pirates. Who were they really? And from there, they were entering England. All right, we just got Phyllis de Morisco. She was in England, even though the ladies admitted she doesn't know how she got there. So how does she know she didn't come through Holland? Right? Through the intercession of Manasseh ben Israel. All right, Manasseh ben Israel, we got his book. He wrote The Hope of Israel. He wrote a whole chapter, and he put out also Antonio Montesino's account of what they saw here and how they had found the lost tribes. These people believed it was the end of the world, and then being persecuted and everything, and how they had found hope in America, the hope of Israel in America, because they had found their so-called long-lost cousins, the lost tribes, the lost tribes. This is all written. Don't kill me. And we ain't talking about religions here when we're talking about lineages and nations, blood. And from England and from the Indies and from Italy, they entered the United States. All right, America. They came here into the land where tyranny is known no more and persecution is fettered fast. Here dwell Christian and Jews side by side, peacefully, lovingly, aiding each other, uniting with each other in the blessed work for which religion exists on earth, and in the spreading of the great principles of political and religious liberty. Here where Christian extends the hand of fellowship unto Jew, and the heart of the Jew beats as loyally American as that of the Christian. Solemnly they pledge, we swear to be a nation of true brothers, never to part in danger or in death. That's deep right there. So you see what's the American Revolution and the Constitution and freedom of religion and all that really about? Who was it for? Who was it really for? Because here a desperate struggle ensued. So they're talking about once they expelled the Jews, basically the Moors were next. All right. Province after province, the Moors were forced to yield to relentless foe. At last, all was lost. The Mohammedan power in Spain was crushed. The Moors and Jews were given the choice between baptism and expulsion. All right, Moors and Jews, hundreds of thousands of them, paying allegiance to the Church of Christ and remained. So a lot of them was like, all right, we'll pretend to be Catholics or Christians. Hundreds of thousands of them, true to their faith, parted heartbroken from the land that was dearer to them than their own life. All right, not Africa, Spain. Who Moors land? Where? Spain. Moors their land dearer than their own life. Spain, Europe, Spain, not Africa. The remaining baptized Jews and Moors were soon suspected of relapsing into their old faith. They relapsed. And the Inquisition was brought and burned them by the thousands. All right, these people got burned at stakes. Who does that start happening to, huh? In the America, supposedly, right? Burned at the stake in thousands, right? And then the ranks of the exiled Jews. With amazing swiftness, Spain's once invincible power began to disappear, becoming weaker with every century. And today, the population of more than 30 million of people before the expulsion of the Jews and Moors, all right? So I told you it was millions, has dwindled down to about 1/2 of that number, while her neighboring countries have increased in numbers and prosperity. So rapid was the fall of Spain, says Buckle in his History of the Civilization of England, Volume 2, Chapter 1, that the most powerful monarchy existing in the world was depressed to the lowest point of debasement, was insulted with impunity by foreign nations, was reduced more than once to bankruptcy, was stripped of her fairest possessions, was held up to public opium, was made a theme on which schoolboys and moralists loved to declaim, respecting the uncertainty of human affairs. Truly did she drink to the dredge the cup of her own shame. Her glory had departed from her. She was smitten down and humbled. The mistress of the world has gone. Her power was gone, no more to return. All right. The Jews and blacks in the early modern world, all right? Sorry about that. Jonathan Scorch is the author. All right. Jews and blacks in the early modern world, Jonathan Scorch. I'm going to read here. It says, there are some medieval Jewish expressions to the effect that Jews were seen in Europe as black and ugly. Keep it in mind that blackness or whiteness is always a relative matter. Indeed, the metaphysical reading one text gave to this color scheme reflects a polemical usage. Such physical theories acquired, perhaps always had, the 13th century text of polemics by R. Joseph and Nathan Official and the Sephardic Yashan, a guide for Jews disputing Christians, probably written in early 14th century German lands, contained nearly identical answers to charges of Jewish ugliness and blackness. All right? The heretics, example Christians, ask and say, why are majority of Gentiles, example Christians, white and attractive, while the majority of Jews are black and ugly? All right, you hear that? Reply to them that it is comparable to fruit. When it begins to blossom, it is white. After it is finished, then it turns black, as with sloes and plums, and every fruit that is red to begin with. When it is done, is white, as with apples and pears or apricots. And this is testimony for Israel that they are pure of menstrual blood. And there is here. All right, so that's their little explanation. So again, we're just reading references from these times, what they're saying. Continuing here, it says, early modern non-Jews in Western Europe also appeared to be confused or ambivalent about the color status of Jews. The English Sir William Barrington visited one of the Sephardic synagogues in Amsterdam in 1635 and wrote that the Jewish men were most black and given unto women, insatiably. I have trouble with that word. In 1643, Isaac de la Pereira, sounds like Pereira, contended that once the Jews convert to Christianity, they will no longer have this dark complexion. So this is deep, metaphor, almost like how you say that? Like a metaphor, right? And so is this what we see when we're looking at census? When they're talking about dark and black, are they just talking about maybe because they're not Christians or seen civilized in the eyes of the census taker? But it's deep. Either way, we know so-called Jews of Spain and Portugal were very dark. We got the actual numerous references on other sources already in past videos. We know what the Moors look like, of course, right? I mean, or are we saying there that the Moors are white now, right? Or they're still so-called black, right? Moors are still so-called black, right? Okay. So a lot of these so-called Sephardic Jews are Moors. All right. So it's interesting now they say, so if you convert to Christianity, you will no longer have this dark complexion. They will change faces and the whiteness of their complexion will have the same brightness as an Englishman. John Greenhalgh visited the Jews synagogue in London and wrote a friend about it in 1662, describing the chief ruler, probably the president of the Parnassum, as a very rich merchant. All right, who's the merchant? A big, black, fierce, and stern man. He was a big, black, fierce, and stern man. At the letter's end, Greenhalgh reiterated with ethnographic precision that the 100 or so Jews he saw at the synagogue are all generally black, so as they may be distinguished from Spaniards or native Greeks. All right, 100 or so, all of them in the synagogue. All right, this is in London. All right, England, the Jews. All right, black, so-called black. For the Jews' hair has a deeper tincture of more perfect raven black. All right, a little bit different than the Spaniards and Greeks. All right, which are also so-called black. The only distinguish is the hair, a little bit of the hair texture. In 1690, the Reverend Robert Kirk of Aberfoyle visited the same Church Alley synagogue, and in his depiction of the worship with almost identical ethnographic punctuation, he said, and this is quotes, "They were all very black men and indistinct in their reasoning as gypsies." All right, just like the gypsies. We got that newspaper from the 1800s in Louisiana in my Acadian video that we did recently, telling us that the gypsies were so dark. They were like a whole different Negro race apart from the other Negroes that were there. All right, the gypsies. All right, we're talking about OG gypsies, the OG gypsies. All right, Egyptians, Egyptians, the Romani, the people from the promise, people of the promise, Ramon, Pomegranate. Look into that, 42. Shout out to Drop Nation. Similar portrayals continued into the 18th century and later. William Black, Secretary of Commissioners, appointed by Governor William Gooch of Virginia to deal with the Indians, described Hester Levy, a daughter of the wealthiest and best-known New York Jew, Moses Levy, whom he met in June 1744, as a very well-made, her complexion black, but very calmly. She had two charming eyes and well-turned, with a beautiful head of hair, coal black. All right. As late as 1753, during the debate in England over that year's Jewish Naturalization Act, one polemicist suggested that anyone who wanted to look Jewish, all right, should rub herself with walnut husk to fix such an indelible hue and make you complete olive beauties with a lively complexion like that of the new Negro from the coast of Guinea. All right. Boom. You want to look Jewish, you got to grab some walnut, man. Paint yourself like a walnut, man. You might get that olive hue like the new Negroes of the coast of Guinea. All right. Shout out to the person who sent me this reference. I believe it was on Instagram. I forget the name, but he knows who he is. Shout out to you, brother. Thank you. for sharing this with all of us. And I found the book, I just took out this part right here real quick. Yeah. Lady Maria Nugent, visiting an 1803 theater performance in Jamaica's Spanish Town, explicitly separated Jews and whites in her depiction of the audience. Members who were all of colors and descriptions, blacks, browns, Jews, and whites. So she said, Jews over here, whites over there. Yeah, in Jamaica. There's also a vulgar error that the Jews are all black, for this is only true of the Portuguese ones, who marrying always among one another beget children like themselves, and consequently the swartiness, all right, the swartiness of their complexion is entailed upon their whole race, all right, swarty, even in the northern regions, even in the cold places, all right, swarty. But the Jews who are originally of Germany, those, for example, I have seen at Prague, are not blacker than the rest of their countrymen. All right, they're not as black. They didn't say they were white. They said they weren't as black. All right. Towards the latter end of the 18th century, one finds the same changeability of the Jews expressed in updated nuances and geographic context. The Reverend Samuel Stanhope Smith wrote that the Jews are fair in Britain and Germany, brown in France. They're brown in France. Fair? That could be light skin, right? Brown in France. And in Turkey, they're swarty. In Portugal and Spain, they're swarty. All right, so brown in France and Turkey, right? And then they're swarty in Portugal and Spain. That's what we're talking about today, right? The Jews and the Moors of Portugal and Spain. We know Moors are swarty, right? So Jews are swarty too, same. People of color that just went through that, getting ripped apart, being packed in ships, right? They say they're olive in Syria and in Chaldea. They're tawny or copper colored in Arabia and Egypt. All right. Perhaps the best indication that the balances involved in such distinctions also conveyed metaphysical imports is the title of mid-17th century English translation of a conversationary tract aimed at Jews by the formerly Jewish Samuel of Morocco, the Blessed Jew of Morocco, or a blackamoor made white, being a demonstration of the true messiahs out of the law and prophets of Rabbi Samuel. A blackamoor made white. All right, that happens so much in history. Yeah. Christians thought, especially among Iberians, often equated Jews and blacks in a moral manner. The 15th century Portuguese poet Álvaro de Brito Pestaña explicated the term Marrano in the following lines, punning on the general negative meaning of Negro. All right, Marranos are Negroes. All right, Marranos who were supposed to be converted Jews into Christianity. Right, people were calling them Negro. Marranos, Marrano. Right, Moreno. Yo soy Moreno. Right, Moreno, Morano. Cimarron, maroon, brownish, maroon, brown. But such views may be passed off as mere descriptive statements about the darkness of Sephardic Jews. The darkness of Sephardic Jews, they soon connected intimately with prescriptive notions based on the significance of physiological or racial characteristics. Thus, in 1750, petition from Kingston, Jamaica, Christians objecting to a recent attempt by Jewish landowner to vote presented the following argument. All right, so this is deep. We're going to get into why. So, because it has something to do with the black codes. All right, so now a Jewish guy wanted to vote, and somebody had a problem with that. It says here, though a mulatto of the fourth descent may vote at elections, yet the Jews, many of whom are mulattoes, right, that degree, are by our wise legislature absolutely excluded from that privilege. All right, you could be a mulatto, but not if you're a mulatto Jew. You can't vote if you're a mulatto Jew. It is being expressly enacted that they, the said mulattoes, shall enjoy all the privileges and immunities of His Majesty's white subjects of this island, provided that they are brought up in the Christian religion, it being also unlawful to employ any Jew in any of the offices of record, they being put in the regard on the foot of mulattoes and Negroes. All right, they're lower. You see what they're saying? That Jews are lower than mulattoes and Negroes by an act of the Governor, Council, and Assembly of this island.
And so let's have a look at the history around about the 15th century and before of these Sephardic Morano Jews that lived around Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula.
How many people really realize what happened within the Jewish community in Spain in 1492?
Well, this is a mystery that God has kept for a long time. Because we've said that Christopher Columbus is from Italy. No, he's from Portugal. No, he's from Spain. Well, where is he really from? Well, they say that he was from Genoa, Italy, but his Italian writing is horrible. But his Castilian is perfect, So, so be it as it may, recently there is a growth, an exponential growth of discoveries that point to the fact that Christopher Columbus, first of all, his name is not Columbus. His name, and not because I'm Hispanic with Sanchez surname and Martinez and so forth, but his name is Colon. And so in Spanish we have it right, Cristobal Colon. So his real name is Salvador Zarco. His real name is Salvador Zarco. All right, but now recently we've discovered that Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colon, was known as a quote-unquote marrano. Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colon, was known as a quote-unquote marrano. Marrano? The marranos are those that were forced to convert to Roman Catholicism, that were Sephardim, and then they were forced to eat pork, which is very unkosher, and then they were called marrano, pigs, swine, because you see the facade of the Spanish Inquisition. What is Inquisition? It comes from the root word to inquire, but this was more than inquiring. This was spying and forcing Jews to convert to Roman Catholicism. So what's happening during this time is that it's not so much the facade of religion to force people to convert. It was greed. It's because the crown, the King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella are going broke. They're exploring all over the place, wars all over the place. They need money, all right? So who's got the money? Who are the financiers? Who are the ones that are so wealthy in Spain and later Portugal? Well, the Sephardim, the Jews, okay. So as early as 1391, there was a major diaspora, meaning scattering, because of the oppression, tortures, burnings at the stake of the Jews before and after conversion.
The story of the slaves in America begins with Christopher Columbus. His voyage to America was not financed by Queen Isabella, but by Luis de Santiago, who advanced the sum of 17,000 ducats, about 5,000 pounds today, equal to 50,000 pounds, to finance the voyage, which began on August 3rd, 1492. Columbus was accompanied by 5 Moranos, Jews who had forsworn their religion and supposedly became Catholics. Louis de Torre, interpreter, Marco, the surgeon, Bamal, the physician, Alonso de la Calle, and Gabriel Sanchez. The reference is The International Jew by Henry Ford. Gabriel Sanchez, abetted by the other 4 Jews, sold Columbus on the idea of capturing 500 Indians and selling them as slaves in Seville, Spain, which was done. Columbus did not receive any of the money from the sale of the slaves, but he became the victim of a conspiracy fostered by Bamal, the ship's doctor. He, Columbus, suffered injustice and imprisonment as his reward, betrayed by the 5 Moranos, or Jews, whom he had trusted and helped. This, ironically, was the beginning of slavery in the Americas. The source is Adventures of an African Slaver, published in 1928, page 11. The Jews were expelled from Spain on August 2nd, 1492, and from Portugal in 1497. Many of these Jews immigrated to Holland, where they set up the Dutch West Indies Company to exploit the New World. In 1654, the first Jew, Jacob Bar Simpson, immigrated from Holland to New Amsterdam, or New York. And in the next decade, many more followed him, settling along the East Coast, principally in New Amsterdam and Newport, Rhode Island. They were prevented by ordinances issued by Governor Peter Stuyvesant from engaging in the domestic economy, so they quickly discovered that the territory inhabited by the Indians would be a fertile field. There were no laws preventing the Jews from trading with the Indians. The first Jew to begin trading with the Indians was Hyman Levy, who imported cheap glass beads, textiles, earrings, armbands, and other cheap adornments from Holland, which were traded for valuable fur pelts. Hyman Levy was soon joined by Jews Nicholas Lowe and Joseph Simon. Lowe conceived the idea of trading rum and whiskey to the Indians and set up a distillery in Newport, where these two liquors were produced. Within a short time, there were 22 distilleries in Newport, all of them owned by Jews, manufacturing and distributing firewater. The story of the debauching of the Indians, with its resultant massacres of the early settlers, is a dramatic story in itself. It is essential to comprehend the seaport of Newport. It is important in order to recognize the Jewish share in the slave commerce. There was a period when it was commonly referred to as, quote, the Jewish Newport World Center of Slave Commerce, unquote. Altogether at this time, there were, in North America, 6 Jewish communities: Newport, Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, Richmond, and Savannah. There were also many other Jews, scattered over the entire East Coast. Although New York held first place in the settlers of Jews in North America, Newport held second place. New York was also the main source of kosher meat, supplying the North American settlements, then the West Indies, and also South America. Now Newport took over. Newport also became the great trade harbor of the East Coast of North America. There, vessels from other ports met to exchange commodities. Newport, as previously mentioned, represented the foremost place in the commerce of rum, whiskey, and liquor dealings. And to include, it finally became the main center of slave dealings. It was from this port that the ships left on their way across the ocean to gather their black human cargo, and then derive great sums of money in exchange for them. An authentic contemporary report based on authority indicates that of 128 slave ships, for instance, unloaded in Charleston within 1 year, their cargo, 120 of these were undersigned by Jews from Newport and Charleston by their own name. About the rest of them, one can surmise, although they were entered as Boston, Norfolk, and Baltimore. Their real owners were similarly the Jewish slave dealers from Newport and Charleston. One is able to assess the Jewish share in the entire dealings of Newport if one considers the undertaking of a lone Jew, Portuguese Aaron Lopez, who plays an important part in the overall story of the Jews and slavery. Concerning the entire commerce of the colonies and the later state of Rhode Island, which included Newport, bills of lading, concessions, receipts, and port clearances carried the signature name of Jew Aaron Lopez. This also took place during the years 1726 to 1774. He had, therefore, more than 50% of all dealings under his personal control for almost 50 years.
And so it was this Moreno Jewish community of slave traders who were very wealthy from Spain and Portugal that had moved into London that created the English Revolution, and they raised up Oliver Cromwell and other dissidents there in England, and so they became supported with their mercenary army and their wealth, and eventually the Scottish king Charles I lost his head. It was with William the Conqueror that the Jews came into England for the first time in numbers, and it wasn't until King Edward Longshanks evicted them in 1290 AD that the Jews were expelled. And then just before the English Revolution, the Jews started to come back in, and Mr. Carvajal was a famous Jew there in London. According to the history of the Bevis Marks synagogue in London that was built by Jews soon after they were allowed to legally return to England in 1664, Abraham Israel Fernandez Carvajal had originally settled in London around 1632 as a Portuguese Jew posing as a Portuguese Marrano Catholic. These Sephardic Jews moved into the Iberian Peninsula with the Celts when they moved there, all the way from Idumea in the southern part of Judea. Like many Marranos living around the Lisbon, Portugal area, he had grown wealthy from the slave trade between Africa and America and back to the ports of Europe. The London Jews say Mr. Carvajal is sometimes called the first English Jew or the Great Jew, who with a group of about 20 Marrano families lived in London. At the time in London, the Goose and Gridiron Ale House, which was situated there in St Paul's Churchyard, was a Masonic lodge. The Goose and Gridiron eventually moved to the King or Queen's Arms Tavern and later became the West Indian and American Lodge. According to the author Abby LaRudin, the Crown Ale House in Parker's Lane near Drury Lane is where Oliver Cromwell met as a Mason. Together with the two other lodges, the Apple Tree and Rummer and Grapes, on the 24th of June 1717, these four lodges formed the Grand Lodge of London, which became the first Grand Orient Jewish lodge in the British Commonwealth. Anyway, prior to the Jews being legally entitled to stay in England, the Marrano Jewish merchants helped finance and support Oliver Cromwell's new army, made up of local dissidents, German mercenaries, and Jewish money. This allowed for Oliver Cromwell to fight the English Civil War against Charles I and brought about the English Revolution, which culminated in Charles I, the Scottish king, being executed for treason. This is what happened. On the 16th of June 1647, Oliver Cromwell wrote a letter to another Marrano Jew living in Melheim, Germany, called Ebenezer Pratt. The letter was found in 1813 by Napoleon Bonaparte in a synagogue in Melheim, which is how it became public. It says, in return for financial support, we'll advocate admission of the Jews. This is impossible while Charles is still alive. It was Ebenezer Pratt who drafted the charges for Oliver Cromwell to bring against Charles I for treason, when really Oliver Cromwell was the traitor all along. In December of 1648, the Rump Parliament of England was formed when the majority of the parliamentarians, who were Scottish Presbyterians, were purged, and so democracy was usurped. The only remaining members were called the Levellers, who were the Freemasons who wanted Charles I tried and executed. Hence the name was given the Rump Parliament, meaning the arse end of Parliament. In return for assistance, Oliver promised the Jews that he would help them rebuild the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, as well as allow the Jews back into England. None of those promises he kept, and the Anabaptists criticised Cromwell for the messianic way he presented himself to the Jews. In 1645, Mr. Carvajal was denounced by an informer for not attending a Protestant church, but was defended by the leading merchants of the day, and so the House of Lords quashed the proceedings. Meanwhile, the Civil War in England was playing out and eventuated in Charles I being executed in January 1649. When the Anglo-Spanish War began in 1655, Cromwell seized all property belonging to the Spaniards living in its territory. But when another Jew, Antonio Rodriguez Robles, found himself denounced and threatened with the loss of all of his property, Carvajal led the entire Sephardic community to appeal to Cromwell and the Council State to recognise them as Jewish refugees rather than as Catholic Marrano Spaniards. Suddenly they admitted to being Jews and were granted permission to stay in London. In 1657, Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel petitioned Oliver Cromwell to readmit the Jews legally back into England. Cromwell appointed an assembly of lawyers and divines to look into the matter. They came back in favour. However, the existing English merchants regarded the Jews as competition and were opposed to it, and so it was Charles II who legally readmitted the Jews in 1664. Charles II was thankful for the support some Jews in Holland had given him. 2 years later, in 1666, the Fire of London took place, which wiped out the commercial centre of the City of London, and by 1694 the Jews owned the private Bank of England, and by 1695 the Bank of Scotland as well.
All right, so now I want to get into this article. Scholarly article says here, the role of Sephardic Jews
in the British Caribbean area during the 17th century. All right, we already know they were the sugar planters, so we're going to get some more correlation here. This is from the Caribbean Studies Journal, Volume 4, Number 3, from October 1964, pages 32 to 49. It's about 18 pages. See how much we can get in today. This is the article right here by Gordon Merrill. The role of Sephardic Jews, Sephardis, all right, people of color. All right, and it says down here in the second paragraph, we're going to begin. It says the transformation of almost uninhabited islands in the Caribbean from a state of nature to agricultural colonies producing sugar for a distant market took place within the remarkably short span of 50 years in the 17th century. All right, so here what they're saying, they grabbed these islands who were very natural and beautiful, probably had a lot of indigenous vegetation, animals, and people, and they turned them into basically sugar producing markets for a distant market for people, for foreign people. What happened to all the local stuff? The accomplishment is even more surprising. All right, listen to this. When it is realized that neither the English planter nor the African slave had any significant previous experience with sugarcane agriculture and the system of sugar manufacture. Okay, there was no African slave brought over here to grow sugar. They didn't know anything about sugar growing. It wasn't them, and it wasn't no English white man planter. Letting you know straight up, there's major drop right here. All right, we should have already concluded that as we're learning and watching this video today, right? Where's the Africans in all of this? Get what I'm saying? They're telling you right here too the same thing. All right. However, Brazil was an important producer of sugar, but somebody was doing it, because Brazil was an important producer of sugar during the early decades of the 17th century, and it is illogical to look for influences from that quarter. All right. So who was running things in that quarter? This is what he's letting you know. It is sometimes claimed that Portuguese Jews from Brazil were no innovators of change in these British colonies during the 17th century, bringing capital, trading skills, slaves, and much needed experience in sugarcane agriculture and sugar manufacture at a critical time in the development of the colonies. This article attempts to establish the facts in order to draw a recent conclusion on the role of the Sephardic Jews in this part of the world during the 17th century, who's running things, who's really setting up shop and helping all these empires grow. Sephardic Jews and their trade and merchandise skills and their growing agricultural skills too with the sugar, their knowledge with the sugar plantations. All right, Sephardic Jews. The curiosity of the writer concerning the Sephardic Jews was aroused in 1952 on first examining the dozen or so remaining tombstones in an unkept Jewish cemetery on Nevis. All right, Nevis, remember Alexander Hamilton? He was a Jewish. Again, he was a Sephardic Jew. That's what we already know. Alexander Hamilton, a person of color. Again, they were calling him a Negro, mulatto, Swarty. They were calling him all these things. We got the video already. All right. He was Huguenot and Sephardic Jew. Huguenot and Sephardic Jew. It boils down to almost the same thing. The dates of burial were from 1660 to 1725. Richard Pottis, in his authoritative book on Nevis, recorded the commercial activity of the Portuguese Jews on the island during that period. Long abandoned burial grounds for these folks exist on the other islands in the Lesser Antilles, and Jewish synagogues have survived into the 20th century of Barbados and Jamaica. All right, so this Jewish cemeteries, again, Alexander Hamilton's ancestors are buried in these Jewish cemeteries, and we got the video and explaining that and showing that. All right, so they're all over these places in Barbados as well, in Jamaica as well. The immediate place of origin of the Jews was Brazil. Most of them had to come out of Brazil, but out of Brazil they had to come originally from Amsterdam or directly from Spain or Portugal, being exiled, or from other countries they were exiled in. So a whole history here, right? So they was from Brazil, from which they fled in the middle of the 17th century in order to escape religious persecution. The ultimate origin of these folks lies in the Mediterranean world. Persecution and forced migration of the Sephardic Jews began in Spain in 1478 with the establishment of the Inquisition
A similar experience of forced migration awaited them in Brazil almost 200 years later. Although the major aim of this paper is to throw whatever light is possible on the role of the Sephardic Jews in the British colonies of the Caribbean, it is necessary to sketch in their background in Europe and in Brazil, and the organization of the paper is to that end. All right, so very scholarly to do that. He's basically saying he's going to do what I'm basically trying to do. I went back, you know, when I did my Sephardi video, I'm still learning. I'm trying to figure out who these guys are. But even though we know they do have some kind of Hebrew, might have Israelite, Edomite, Moabite blood, Canaanite blood in them, Ishmaelite blood in them, Arabs, you know, they have some kind of Jewish, and you know they are related to some people in Asia Minor, the original Sephardi area over there. I think that's what he's about to get into. It says European background. It says Sephardic Jews have a long, at times illustrious history in Europe. Semitic traders from Sidon and Tyre traveled the length of the Mediterranean world in classical times and settled on the distant Iberian shores. The Jews were influential during the Roman period, but they enjoyed a truly golden age under the Moors. All right? What? We got this a lot in my past videos, Columbus and his Negro friends. We also got it in the Moorish videos that I made. No more hijack, no more misunderstanding. The Sephardic Jews actually were very prosperous. That was their golden age time too, under the Moors, when they were free to move within Muslim world in search of economic and intellectual gains. They became rich, aristocratic, learned, haughty, and powerful. The Sephardic Jews and the Moors, they were together, is what I showed you. Eventually the name Sepharad, the original was over there, came to be applied by the Hebrews to the kingdoms of Castilla, Navarra, Aragon, and Portugal. And Jews of Spain and Portuguese origin became known as Sephardic Jews. All right, again, people of color living prosperous under the Moors, their brothers and cousins. In contrast to the Ashkenazim, all right, it's different. All right, listen to this. Sephardic Jews, in contrast to the Ashkenazims or European Jews of Slavonic origin, they're different. All right, you were blaming these people this whole time. You were picturing these Ashkenazi European Jews of Slavonic origin. You know, that's what you were always picturing. And it was actually the Sephardic Jews living under the Moors, prosperous, their brothers, right? A lot of them related, you know. It was actually them setting up shop, colonizing over here first. Sephardic Jews adopted a veneer of Christianity under the compulsion of the Inquisition. So they adopted Christianity, right? They had to become what? Presbyterians, Protestants, Quakers, Baptists, all right? You know, these new Christians. And those who emigrated to the New World were termed New Christians, like I just said, appropriately and disapprovingly by the Spanish chroniclers. The Sephardic Jews were archly conservative in outlook, preserving the intellectual traditions that had evolved in Moorish Spain and North Africa. They invited the attention of bigots in an age of religious intolerance. The conservatism of the Sephardim is still to be observed in the 20th century in the attachment to a particular pronunciation of Hebrew and in the instinctive preference for an unchanging simplicity of service in the synagogue. Furthermore, congregations of Spanish Jews in the United States who have been away from Spain for centuries are said to retain to the present time the Spanish language. In the Middle Ages, Spain and Portugal, in somewhat contrasting ways, attempted to solve the problem posed by these rich, influential folk of unpopular belief, and in so doing, Portugal in particular produced a number of new Christians prepared to throw off the cloak of new religion at the first opportunity. All right, who these people were, what is their history. We eventually got all this, but it was important to know, like I did show in my video, that they were merchants and they were traders from way back, from ancient times. They had all the routes. That's why it was natural for them to become the merchants in the sea. You get what I'm saying? These Moranos, especially when they were under the Moors, right? The Moors going around, these old school Phoenicians, you know, influencing these old school Danites. All right, so continue a little further. This article says at the beginning of the 16th century, Spain and Portugal contained no practicing Jews, only new Christians or Moranos. All right, they had to practice in secret, as they were known in the Iberian Peninsula. Although they were forbidden to leave their homelands, lest they discard the new religion, before the long, Morano fugitives began to appear in other parts of Europe. Many of them reached the Low Countries of Northern Europe in the late 15th, 16th century, where they maintained an outward attachment to Christianity. All right, what is that? Protestantism. Portuguese Marrano communities at home played an important role in overseas trade and enjoyed connections with new Christian communities abroad that were starting to establish their network. By way of example, the great Marrano mercantile House of Mendes, which held the coveted pepper monopoly, all but rivaled the Fuggers at one time in the extent and importance of its transactions. In 1512, the House of Mendes established its Antwerp branch. Antwerp, remember that? An indication of the network of international financial power in the hands of the Portuguese Jews. Amsterdam and Antwerp became centers of Marrano population and power during the 16th century. Centers. Who was running stuff in Amsterdam and who was there also hugging us, right? Remember, we're going to get into that again. The Inquisition was established in Portugal in 1531, and new Christians from their south a refuge in northern Europe. The trickle of fugitives became a flood after the declaration of Dutch independence in 1579, which brought the expectation of full religious freedom. Within a few years, Marranos settled in Amsterdam as Jews, and they were joined by many others from Antwerp who threw off the cloak of secrecy and openly practiced Judaism. Amsterdam eventually had over 4,000 Sephardic Jews and gained the title of the Dutch Jerusalem. It is noteworthy that until the establishment of the State of Israel, Amsterdam remained the spiritual center of Sephardic Jewish communities scattered throughout the world. You hear that? Amsterdam, Dutch. During this period, England remained close to Sephardic refugees. At this point, it is useful to turn to the entry of these folk into Brazil, from which they later spread into the Caribbean area and North America. All right, so see what we're getting into, right? So it's number 2. The entry of Sephardic Jews into the New World. Spain and Portugal sought by legislation to keep their colonies in the New World free of Jews and new Christians. Persecution at home and the magnet of trading opportunity abroad encouraged these folks to work against that policy. Many succeeded, for such restrictive laws are difficult to enforce in any age. Furthermore, it appears that official policy did not remain unshaken over the centuries involved. From time to time, new Christians were able to secure the suspension of the restrictive laws by purchase. For example, in 1509, an agreement was reached in Seville between the Conversos and the Crown, whereby new Christians were permitted to go to the colonies for purposes of trade periods not exceeding 2 years on payment of a fee of 20,000 ducats. Also, it appears that on occasion, officialdom wavered in its basic policy and permitted new Christians to emigrate to the colonies, probably in recognition of the need for colonists. So they were making deals with them, like I was saying earlier, right? In any event, facts speak clearly. Thousands of Sephardic Jews managed by legal means or otherwise to reach the New World as new Christians. Thousands. Life had been subject to suspicion and intrigue for the secret Jews in Portugal. The Inquisitions of Lisbon, Coimbra, and Evora held 47 great autos de fe between 1612 and 1630, and this feverish activity against the secret Jew provided the motive to illegal emigration. The Inquisition went to astounding lengths to identify the non-believers and to save their souls at the expense of their lives. The religious quality of the blood was examined and classified by the agents of the Inquisition with obvious zeal. Heretics were judged to be full, 3/4, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, partly or more than partly new Christians. The attraction of a freer society in the New World must have been great for these Jews. Recife in northern Brazil fell to the Dutch in 1630. Within 6 years, Dutch control extended from Rio San Francisco in the south to the captaincy of Maranhão in the north, and the Dutch colony became known as New Holland. All right, New Holland in Brazil. There was a considerable amount of religious toleration in a population that contained Dutch Protestants. All right, there we go, Protestants. Who's these Protestants? Huguenots, right? Portuguese Catholics, new Christians, professing Jews, native Indians, and Negro slaves. A lot of these people are the same. In 1634, the State General issued a proclamation guaranteeing Jews and Catholics the free practice of their religion without investigation of their conscience or their home. Under these circumstances, the Marranos threw off the cloak of Christianity and openly embraced their own religion. They were joined by numerous Jewish immigrants from Holland, and in 1640, the Jewish inhabitants of Recife were said to be more numerous
than the Christians. By 1654, the city is reported to have had 5,000 Jewish inhabitants. Attention is now directed to the economic activities of these folks. Contemporary accounts are not numerous, but John Neuhoff has left a rather detailed account of New Holland, which he visited in 1643. Neuhoff was impressed by the sugar industry in the colony, to the point of proclaiming that no other place in the West Indies could enter the industry with any prospect of profit. As for the Jewish inhabitants, he wrote, all right, among the free inhabitants of Brazil that were not in the company's service, Dutch West India Company, the Jews were the most considerable in number, who had transported themselves thither from Holland. They came from Holland. But who were these Holland Jews? They were Sephardic Portuguese people of color. They had a vast traffic beyond all the rest. They purchased sugar mills and built stately houses in the Recife. They were all traders, which could have been of great consequence to the Dutch Brazil had they kept themselves within the due bounds of traffic. All right, and continuing a little bit ahead, it says, during the course of the struggle by the Portuguese. All right, so remember what's going on. I know it's a lot of info, guys. I don't know if you guys are bored or not, but I hope you guys are enjoying this information. You know, I just, for me putting it all together, it's just, I'm just like, wow. You know, I just wanted everybody to see this information and kind of like get a whole background behind it, you know, a real historical background of who these people are and everything. It's not just labels like Portuguese, Jews, Dutch, you know, these are people, there's backgrounds behind these people, you know. It's like they call anybody an American today, right? It's everybody indigenous to America that they're being called American, you know. So just like these people, they might be called Dutch, they might be called French, but a lot of them are Sephardic Jews or Muslim Moors from Spain and Portugal. All right, this is the what I'm trying to show in this particular study, the presentation, and it says here, you know, that, you know, the Dutch had control of Brazil for a bit. You know, they had taken it from the Portuguese, and, you know, Jews were like, yeah, you know, we get to be Jews again and everything. So eventually the Portuguese regained control of Brazil, or this part. So what happened? Many Jews basically became convinced that for their own safety they should move to neighboring colonies such as Cayenne and Suriname. The fall of Recife in 1654, so that's when the Portuguese took over again. Thousands of Jews were given 3 months to leave Brazil or suffer the consequences of open adherence to Judaism and Catholic calling. Now remember, even though a lot of these are originally Portuguese people that they're calling Jews, and it's Portugal who's taking the control. Remember, these are Portuguese Catholic Empire now. This is the Portuguese Catholic Empire, and who are most likely people of color too. It's not like, you know, we're talking about the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, that was Charles V who was doing that against the Protestant faith and Jews and Moors, Muslims. So they were given 3 months to leave, these Jews in Brazil, or suffer the consequences of open adherence to Judaism and Catholic colony. These were the events that linked together all the Sephardic Jewish communities scattered throughout the Caribbean region during the 17th and 18th centuries. So again, they'll say that, you know, if they didn't come directly from Holland or from Portugal, Spain, these Sephardic Jews, in history, they'll tell us, well, they came from Brazil. Now we know the whole background of how they got to Brazil, who are these people and what happened and how they ended up in these other islands in the Caribbean, like Nevis, you know, Jamaica, Suriname, Trinidad. Eventually, descendants of these folk established Sephardic communities in seaports along the Atlantic seaboard of North America. Eventually, where did they end up? In North America, and along where? The Atlantic seaboard. I want to South Carolina, right? Particularly in the cities of Providence, Newport, and New York. All right, you see? Providence, Newport, and New York. Rhode Island, Newport, New Jersey, or New York, and then New York, right? It's convenient at this point in the narrative to pause and to consider the prospects of that faced the Portuguese Jews about to leave Brazil. The vast majority of these folks sought and eventually gained entry into English-speaking lands. Public opinion in England at that time was against permitting Jews to enter the country. The story began to circulate in England in 1649 that the Jews had offered to buy St. Paul's Cathedral and the Bodleian Library, inconceivable as truth, but well designed to increase the blood pressure of patriotic Englishmen. During the Protectorate, Oliver Cromwell displayed religious toleration in advance of his times and probably some appreciation of potential economic development in allowing some Jews to enter the country. They were Sephardic Jews,
but more probably from Amsterdam than from Brazil. Cromwell met the question of Jewish immigration into England obliquely by failing to pronounce a policy, a course political action not unknown in the 20th century. It worked to the advantage of the Jews in that they were not singled out for special taxation. It was not until later in the 17th century that the legal rights to reside and trade in England was restored to them. In contrast, the colonial authorities in England were well disposed toward the entry of Jewish refugees from Brazil into the colonies of the Caribbean region. At the same time, the Dutch authorities encouraged Jewish migration to their mainland and inland colonies lying to the north of Brazil. For their part, the Jews, with experience as traders and planters, with capital and slaves, were anxious to carry on with a lucrative enterprise in sugar. Accordingly, within the space of a few years, Portuguese Jews became residents of the Guiana coast and the various islands from the mainland Suriname to Jamaica, where they engaged in trading and agricultural pursuits. All right, so you see how they're populating the rest of the Caribbean and eventually into North America. All right, now we're in this book. I've gone over this book. We read it in my Huguenots video, read a good amount of it. Really good info in the Huguenots video. Again, I recommend you guys to go watch my Huguenot video if you haven't, especially, I mean, it's a 4 or 5 hour video, but it's a lot of good info. I read a lot of things from this book and other information. But we're going to just skim through this book. I haven't read all of it in this book, so I'm going to read it now. It's called and this is a genealogical history. Jews and Muslims in British colonial America. Jews and Muslims in British colonial America. You see these two symbols right here. And then you see the tree, signifying a family tree, a branch of genealogy. And you can interpret it however you want. This is by Elizabeth Hirschman and Donald Yates. Very good, informative book, very scholarly, a lot of sources to verify the information they're saying. All right, we're right in the preface of this book. Second paragraph, just want to read here. It says, in this work, we present a series of colonial documents, contemporary first-hand accounts, records, portraits, family genealogies, and ethnic DNA test results, which fundamentally challenged the national storyline depicting America's first settlers as white, British, and Christian, all right? They weren't white or British or Christians. All right, you guys ready? We postulate that many of the initial colonists were of Sephardic, Jewish, and Muslim Moorish ancestry. All right, they didn't ever taught this, to us in history. They made us think of the, like this George Washington looking kind of people, But this is the truth right here. All right, that's why I highlight it. Guys, keep that in your mind. All right, correlating with everything we're learning, right? Usually arriving as crypto Jews with their religious adherents disguised as crypto Muslims. All right, disguised as crypto Muslims, Moors. These immigrants served in prominent economic and political, financial, and social positions in all of the original colonies. All right, you see, it's deep. Talking about who cares about this, who cares about hugging, who cares about these ain't our people. Hey man, you never know what's in your genealogy or ancestry. The evidence in support of this radical new narrative begins with an examination of the British colonial companies organized in England to bring settlers to North America and exploit the natural riches believed to be there. All right, so now if you've been following me for a while, if you watch some of my Swarte Europe videos, my Huguenot video, even before that, South Carolina video, you guys kind of already know I have a background. Nations of the World video, have a background of where these Sephardic Jews are coming from. What's their story? How did they become British? How did they become Christian? How did they get erased? Remember, they were saying they vanished. They don't exist anymore. How did they just disappear all of a sudden? If they were the initial colonists, where did they go? Where's their history, right? So we got a background, a big background. I'm glad I did all those other videos before this, even though we might go back into those topics again. Just wanted to lay, a foundation before we got into this. Like this author's letting you know. Of course, both Spain and France had already made forays into North America, found in St. Augustine and exploring parts of the coastline as far north as Newfoundland. though their activities as foreign powers are given short shrift in our Anglo-centric version of the birth of America. What is even less frequently mentioned regarding the Spanish and French settlements and voyages is that many of the colonists and sailors were of Sephardic Jewish and Muslim Moorish descent. All right? That's what they weren't letting us know. It wasn't frequently mentioned that these were actually Sephardic Jewish and Muslim Moorish descent. All these navigators, sailors. Several of those on board Christopher Columbus' first voyage in 1492, and famously even Colon himself, were Jewish ancestry. And we ain't talking about Ashkenazi here. We're talking about people of color. We're talking about Iberians. What does Sephardic mean according to the American Jewish Archives Journal, Hebrew University in Cincinnati? Anybody who's from Iberian, non-Jew or even Jew. They were Jews or crypto-Jews. Crypto-Jews. One historian of Inquisitional Spain and biographer of Christopher Columbus, Simon Wiesenthal, notes that throughout the 16th century, the movement of the Marranos to the New World had continued, and that after the expulsion of the Jews and flight of the Marrano element, it was the turn of the Moriscos to serve as scapegoats for the ills of society. Scapegoats. The same writer estimates that all told, Spain lost 1.5 million people. 1.5 million people as a consequence of the purification of its population of Jews and Moors. Where did all these people end up? All these people of color. Many occupations were virtually abandoned, he writes. Trade, the crafts, the sciences languished. Moreover, since the branches of endeavor had been domain of Jews and Moriscos, they had become in themselves suspect. Spaniards had to be extremely careful about entering any of these fields. Spanish life as a whole was the worse for these injustices. Spain was swamped with fortune hunters from all parts of Europe, but they could not revive the Spanish economy. Just as the irrigation canals dug by the Moors in Andalusia were allowed to silt up, so the very channels on which the country's health depended fell into neglect. You hear that? The Moors were keeping it clean. They had the technology there where their aqueducts and their canals, they had the city clean. And, when they were kicked out, nobody maintained it. We document that Spain's loss was Britain's gain. Beginning with the initial planning, organization, and promotion of the first British colonial efforts, Sephardic Jews and Muslim Moors were present as navigators, ship captains, sailors, metallurgists, cartographers, financiers, and colonists. All right, that's big right there. You hear this? This is the real history. I hope you guys see. Again, we're learning a lot. It's just coming all out. This is real history right here. Who was all these captains, all these people providing their ships, their skills and navigation? Who were all these people that they didn't mention to us? A lot of these were people of color, so-called black people that they left out of history because they wanted you to think these were all white Europeans. So they were a big part of the initial colonial efforts, all right? Among these, we find Joaquim Gans, Simon Ferdinando, Walter Raleigh, Sephardic Jew, Walter Raleigh, John Hawkins, Sephardic Jew, Humphrey Gilbert, Richard Hakluyt Sr. and Jr., Francis Drake, Martin Frobisher, and Abraham Ortelius. All right, so John Hawkins, that's a big one right there because, see, Cape Verde was full of Sephardic Jews too that were sent over there. And John Hawkins supposedly invaded Cape Verde. Now remember, that was a Portuguese colony, meaning a Catholic Empire colony, even though they had Portuguese Jews in there working or as indentured servants, right? So John Hawkins might have gone and taken his own people and went and provided them or sent them or put them in America. All right, so all these people, Richard Hakluyt, the Hakluyt Society, all the collections they have, the books, these are all Sephardic people. Francis Drake, the famous Francis Drake, Martin Frobisher, and Abraham Ortelius, right? So we might go in depth. Actually, I am going to go in depth more on some of these people, especially with Francis Drake, possibly Walter Raleigh, John Hawkins now, especially that I know in their history, their background, Sephardic Jews. It brings up a whole other study. Now it says here, the first and second British colonies in North America Virginia, and Massachusetts were provisioned, funded, and peopled by persons of Sephardic, Jewish, and Muslim Moorish descent. Again, again, man, I'm gonna highlight this. I hope you guys. I'm gonna go slow so we can get this, so you guys can understand all this. All right. So we have a lot of background before this. If you're new to this information, make sure you watch my previous videos. But we have all the history behind this. We know there was Black Europeans. We know the Moors and the Sephardic Jews held it down for hundreds of years in Andalusia and Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. We know these are people in general of color, so-called black people. We know they spread throughout Europe during the Inquisition, and even before that they were being persecuted, taking on many titles: Huguenots, Presbyterian, Protestants, New Christians, Crypto Jews, Secret Jews, Marranos, Moriscos, eventually taking tags where they were going, the location, the landmass, so they would become Dutch, French, Portuguese, Swiss, English, Irish, Scotland. So all these people, but in reality were Sephardic Jews and Muslim Moors. All right, so you can see again this very first line in this paragraph: the first and second British colonies in North America, Virginia and Massachusetts. All right, they were provisioned. All right, who was running the merchandise, the market, the network, the shipping, the trade? Of course, it was provisioned and funded and peopled by the Sephardic Jews and Muslim Moorish descent. They had lost almost everything in their homeland, but they had a whole new promised land. Current genealogical studies of the Appalachian descendants of these early colonists demonstrate that they carried DNA haplotypes, male or female lineages, and genes from Sephardic, Ottoman, and North African founders. You'll find all this history around in all these tribes. Again, we read about the Melungeons, but other tribes do have it too. A lot of these tribes, sometimes even the indigenous people would take on these tags, like saying they're Turkish or North African, because at the time it was better to say that than Indian, or vice versa. And when Moors and Sephardic Jews would come, they would marry into the indigenous people's family, and sometimes it would be best for them to just say they're Catawba, Cherokee, and so on and so on. All right, depending on the situation. That's real history right there. All right. Further, these early North American colonists often bore straightforwardly Jewish and Muslim surnames. Attested are Ali, Alif, Saracen, Moises, Bagsel, Haggadah, Okazant, and even Saladin. Indeed, given the patently non-Christian backgrounds of so many settlers up and down the Atlantic coastline, non-Christian backgrounds of the American colonies all along the Atlantic coastline, all right, it becomes difficult to ignore the significant declarations of religious tolerance inscribed in the U.S. Constitution. You see why America became what it became. The Constitution, all that. There's a whole background here, not just the indigenous part here from the Iroquois and all that, Confederation and all that, but also what they brought, the Sephardic Jews and the Muslim Moors, what they brought over. Even and particularly New York, founded by the Dutch as New Amsterdam, was heavily peopled by Sephardic Jews and Muslim Moors. New York, all right, understand this, please. And this is not to bash anybody, make anybody feel like they're not indigenous or anything, but you understand a lot of these people, and they had a lot of offspring and descendants that they left behind in these places, like in New York, all right? Who are these people mixing with the Shinnecock, with ODB's family? Who's ODB? Can he have also Sephardic Jew and Muslim Moor in him other than Shinnecock? Most likely, yes. This is what I'm trying to explain, all right? But I don't know. He might be more one side or more on the other side. Who knows? I'm just saying it's part of the history. And again, these are people of color, so-called black people, right? Founded by Dutch, as New Amsterdam was, all right? And these Dutch were Sephardic Jews and Muslim Moors. The presence of persons from these ethnic affiliations on the governing boards of the Dutch West and East India companies. Again, another source letting us know who was running things, and the Dutch West and East India companies against Sephardic Jews had their hands all over this. Muslim Moors had their hands all over these companies that were supposed to be enslaving Africans, right? This is what they told us growing up, right? These are people of color mostly running this, financing this, providing the networks, the ships, making it all happen, the networks with their poor Jews, their families, their merchant international organization they had already built for hundreds of years. That was their whole background, even from ancient times. They included Jonathan Cohen and Cornelius Spielman, another classic Jewish name. Other New Amsterdam and later New York residents were Jacob Abrahamson and Dennis Isaacson. We present contemporaneous testimony suggesting that even the leading Knickerbocker families of the New York colony, the Van Cortlands, Phillipses, Van Rensselaers, Delanoes, and the Lanceys were Sephardic ancestry. All these prominent families of New York were what? Sephardic ancestry, Iberian people. This fresh look at colonial American genealogies and settler lists present for the first time in one source the Spanish, Hebrew, Arabic, and Jewish origins and meaning of more than 5,000 surnames. More than 5,000 surnames. You hear this? The vast majority of them widely assumed before to be sturdy British family names of ancient Baron. All right? All these families, all these people thought they were English. All these, the history they told us, the lie, the fake history, the hijack, dodge the hijack. All right? We're going strong in 2021. We surfing the wave strong. Thanks for everybody that's come before me teaching, paving the way so we can learn how to even investigate and study and what to look for. Thank you. Look how far we've gotten, and now we're seeing that there's at least in this book 5,000 surnames that were supposed to be British are actually Spanish, Hebrew, Arabic, and Jewish origin. Many of our name etymologies plainly contradict the standard reference works. The decipherment of surname history is an involved subject, one that can extend over centuries of transformation in several countries and require knowledge of a multitude of languages. You hear that? Do you have that knowledge? And that's what we've been doing in the last 4 or 5 years. All of us. Combining all our knowledge in the different languages with the different sources and everything. For instance, in order to understand the sea change suffered by the ancient Jewish name Phoebus to English Phillips, and Scottish Forbes and Frobisher, we already know Forbes, right? We got it in the last video, Farabas. That's a Moroccan name, Forbes. With stages along the way of Farabas and Farabi and Furby, one must have an appreciation for the synthesizing religions of the Roman Empire, including the cult of Mithras, a naming practice of the Greek-speaking congregations of Jews, as well as conversion of Berber populations to Judaism. Berber populations converting to Judaism. Conquest of Spain by Berber armies in 710 and subsequent development of Judeo-Arab culture. Not to mention the medieval French Norman, all right, the Normans, who's these Normans, Anglo-Saxon and Scottish linguistic. We got all that background already, right? Orthographic and social filters, the surname passed through until it became enshrined in modern times as good old English Phillips. You hear that? So Phoebus eventually became Phillips, and it has a whole history there that it just mentioned. All right? Make sure you remember that. There's a whole history behind the surnames and your family's surnames if you have Phillips. All right, we're in the introduction of the book. Again, this is Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America, a genealogical history by Elizabeth Hirschman and Donald Yates. And right here it says, despite the small nucleus and founder effect, both the Normans and American colonists were extremely diversified in their rank and file. All right, so they're talking about how the Normans invaded England and how these English eventually came into Americas, but both these Normans and these later English colonists who came to the American colonies were very diversified. The former included Danes, Vikings, Norwegians, Flemings, Picards, Bretons, Frenchmen, many from Toulouse and Aquitaine. In the south, the region called Languedoc. All right, Languedoc, big part where the Sephardic Jews and Muslims went after they were expelled, and the Huguenots became, and a number of Spanish or French Jews and Muslims, right? So The last mentioned typically operated the armories, mints, and construction industries while supplying most mercantile professions with a strong component, as well as all banking personnel and civil servants because of their literacy and fluency in accounting. Remember, they were the ones taking care of all that. A little further down here, it says here the largest emigration of all occurred with the so-called Huguenots, who, as we shall see, were in many cases second or third generation Spanish and Portuguese Jews, the Huguenots, who traded the French colors for English. So they went from Spanish to Portuguese to representing France, and then from there, representing England, they traded the French colors for English, Flemish, then Flemish, or some other nationality as they fled religious persecution. So they were switching up anywhere they went, assimilated, amalgamating. Continuing, says here, in addition to Jewish genealogies, we have made an effort to bring to life some of the forgotten women who shaped the colonial American experience. These include the ancient mother of European royalty, the Occitan Jewish queen Ita, Charlemagne's great-great-grandmother, Mary Lago, the Sephardic Jewish mother of the Quakers founder George Fox, right? His mom, the founder of the Quakers, his mom was Sephardic, so he was Sephardic. And Malaya Cooper, the Jewish mulatto wife of Daniel Boone's guide, whose Hebrew name is the same as one of President Barack Obama's daughters. Some of their stories will surprise readers, running counter to traditional historical accounts. Few people realize that one of the Salem witches mounted a legal defense using the family's professional connections and wealth. Sarah Town, Clays, fought her accusers and lived to become a founder of the town of Framingham, Massachusetts, all right? So she wasn't hanged or anything, condemned a witch, because she had her Sephardic connections, right? Legal defense. So she was actually a founder of Framingham. Wow. The mother of Patrick Henry, according to diarist William Byrd, was a handsome woman of the family of Esau. She was an Edomite, whose first husband in Aberdeen, Scotland, was of the family of the Saracens, all right? Or the sons of Sarah. We're talking about, it's just like Muslim people, Arab people. It says the Cherokee beloved woman, Nancy Ward, bore an Arabic name. One of the sub-themes of the present study is the interaction between immigrants and American Indians, all right? Listen to this. Between immigrants and American Indians, all right? Readers will find Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and other genealogies that reflect intermarriage between Jews or Muslims and America's native inhabitants, all right? Believed and thinking of the day to be Abraham's children. Who's Abraham's children? The America's native inhabitants, the Hebrews. Who? America's native inhabitants. They were assimilating, mixing in, and marrying with the American Indians, these same Sephardic Moorish people. All right. We continue in the book, Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America, a Genealogical History. And this is chapter 1. Of course, we ain't reading the whole book. We're just belly flopping, but we try to get some good info. It says here, both academic studies and informal family histories attest that many of the Spanish and Portuguese colonists in Central and South America, Mexico, and the Caribbean were Conversos and Moriscos. Although they might appear to be good Catholic Christians on the surface, they were in reality crypto-Jews and crypto-Muslims, secret Jews and secret Muslims. All right, that's who the Spanish and Portuguese were, and this is what I was trying to explain to you. A lot of the times, you know, this is what I was starting to see correlate, and this book is clearly saying it now. This study, same research this person did, came to the same conclusion. When you lead, you know, when you look for truth, it could only be one way, right? They practice the traditions of Judaism and Islam. Who? Spanish and Portuguese colonists. And then what did they do? They practice the traditions of Judaism and Islam. All right, remember that. You guys taking notes, right? So when we're talking about Spanish and Portuguese, remember when you're saying, oh, when the Spanish came, Remember, you're talking about crypto Jews and crypto Muslims. Every time you say, oh, when the Spanish came, or the Spanish and the Spanish, Portuguese, when the Portuguese, well, that you're talking about crypto Jews and crypto Muslims who practice traditions of Judaism and Islam in the privacy of their own homes, sometimes in small de facto communities of intermarried family groups. Both Judaic and Islamic law excuse this behavior on grounds that such temporizers were constrained to submit to political pressures to save life and property. The earliest martyrs to the commandment of the Torah requiring Jews to declare themselves as separate and set apart from other people were called anusim, forced ones. The Inquisition rolled out a dragnet complete with tip sheets, rewards, and public spectacles. The feared auto de fe Judaizers as well as Moriscos, Moriscos were the Moor Muslims, were burned at the stake as heretics. Spain's Muslim population survived longer than its Jews, but the final wave of extradition for them came in 1614. They left in droves for safe havens in lowlands, England, and Ottoman Empire. All right, we continue the same book down here. This part we've already read in the Huguenot video, but we're just going to read it again. It starts talking about, the same what's going on in Spain and Portugal and what ended up happening. A lot of these people fleeing to the American colonies. Again, it says officials often concluded in protecting persons of Jewish and Muslim ancestry who were important to the smooth functioning of the state. In truth, the three cardinal events mentioned above are interwoven, for historians have identified 5 Jews among 90 sailors in Columbus' expedition. All of them were probably intent not only of finding the riches of the East Indies, in all likelihood of Jewish ancestry. He is believed to have been a descendant of Spanish Jews, the Colon family. So Columbus was Jewish himself. We got another source here who had converted and moved to Genoa following the massacre of 1391. The prominent historian Salvador de Madariaga wrote an authoritative biography in which he came to this conclusion, and Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal's book Sails of Hope popularized the idea. All right, Columbus, a Jew. Historians speculate that the first European to sight land on October 12, 1492 was also Jewish. The sailor Juan Rodriguez Bermejo, called Rodrigo de Triana, left Spain upon Columbus' return and entered the service of the Moors in Morocco. His name in the memory of are honored today by American Jews, for whom the story of the auspicious beginning is a point of immense pride. Hundreds of Jews exiles from Spain and Portugal followed Bermejo and made a name for themselves as the Jewish pirates of the Caribbean. All right, and I got a future video on this. All right, but yeah, as you can see, we got a little bit on the last video too. Who was really in these ships and what were these people's complexion, all that? Who were they really? Now, did you ever think it was be a Jew? What you thought it was a Jewish pirates of the Caribbean, as Dr. Edward Chrysler calls them, including Moroccan-born Samuel Palachi, the pirate rabbi. The focal point of the present work, however, is not the southern or central portions of the Americas, not the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Americas. A case will be made here for crypto-Jewish and crypto-Muslim presence in British North America. We propose that many of the initial colonists in Virginia, all right, many of the initial colonists in Virginia, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Maryland were of Jewish and Moorish descent, all right? If not of Jewish and Moorish self-identification or public labeling as such, Appendix A presents an abundance of source material concerning Jewish surnames. The question of any given individual's religious adherence can be bracketed for the time being. At any rate, each claim about religion has to be answered on a case-by-case basis, all right? They made their studies. They know what they're talking about. You got to get specific. No more generalization. And very little research has been completed on the varieties of the Jewish religious experience in colonial America. Appendix B, Rituals and Practices of the Secret Jews, and Appendix C, Muslim Rituals and Beliefs, contain a mixture of religious traditions and social customs. What is central to our inquiry is ancestry. We suggest Dutch, New Amsterdam, later British New York and New Jersey, harbored and sometimes welcomed people of Jewish ancestral origins and affinities. All right. And it breaks down what's going on again in Spain and learn how they fled to France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, becoming important people there. This part, again, we got in the Huguenot video. We're going to get it like this the first time again. It says, although the bulk of the refugees fled to North Africa and Ottoman of Turkish lands in the Levant, thousands of others thousands of others sought safety in France and the Low Countries. As Protestantism swept across Western Europe, many of these Jewish Conversos and Moriscos became often only outwardly Protestant. What? All right, again, let me highlight that. Many of the Jewish Conversos and Moriscos became often only outwardly Protestant. Huguenots, New Christians, all right, swelling the ranks of the dissenters. Some even provided leaders for the Huguenots, Hussites, Anabaptists, Calvinists, German Reformed, Walloons, Mennonites, Dunkards, Quakers, Puritans, and Presbyterians. All these people, possible connection, strong connection to Jewish Conversos and Moriscos, Moors. When the British, Dutch, and French began establishing colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, they sent as colonists not subjects of high political and social rank from their respective countries, but for the most part recently arrived patently anti-Catholic, newly minted Protestants. Many were debtors, prisoners, or servants, indentured, right? Cast-outs of society who were struggling to get onto their own feet in a new country. Continuing in the book further down, skipped a couple pages here, but it says here, a good overview of the role of Sephardic Jews in the history of modern-day mercantilism can be gleaned from Sephardic Genealogy 2002 by Jeffrey Malka. This study observes that Dutch Sephardim in the Netherlands were small merchants or shopkeepers. They dealt in tobacco and fish, worked as tailors or goldsmiths, physicians, and money changers, and ran grocery stores. But some, such as the Pereira, Barrios, and Pinto families, rose to great wealths. Sephardic merchants dominated the lucrative trade in sugar, tobacco, silk, and precious stones, right? Sugar and tobacco, that's big. Wealthy Sephardim were very important both in the founding and running of the Dutch East India and West India companies, all right? The Sephardis, these are people of color who were very important in the founding and running of the Dutch East India and West India companies. Weren't these companies supposedly enslaving Africans and bringing them to America? There's a whole different story now here, right? Whole different perspective. What were they really using their ships for? A role we shall later show had great significance for the early history of the Dutch colony of New York. Malka further notes that the Sephardim usually traded with their relatives who lived as secret Jews in Spain, Portugal, and their possessions, example, the Canary Islands, Brazil, Florida, Cuba, and Mexico. They used aliases in order to protect their kinsmen from the Inquisition. All right, so they're talking about that global Protestant network, that Port Jews, right, or the Sephardic global network they had. And so they're showing how they changed their names. So this guy, Samuel Abravanel, became Samuel de Sousa, Samuel Abod, Antonio Sanchez de Paz, Joseph Cohen, Jeronimo Enriquez. Isaac Franco is Francisco Mendez de Madeiros. Menace ben Israel became Manuel Diaz Soreira. All right, so that's how they changed their names, right? Jewish merchants had an important advantage in being able to do business with and draw bills of exchange on relatives, friends, or business associates they could trust. Often, and especially in England, they used the names of local citizens who were sympathetic to their cause as a front for their activities, giving the new associate stock in joint venture. If the partner married into the family, frequent outcome, he became an adopted member of the clan, subject to his rules of secrecy and code of commerce. Are you hearing this? What's going on? So they had even people running for them, basically picking up the money, doing all the work. They had people doing it under different names, so their name wouldn't come up on it. Caribbean Jews. Mordecai Arbel in The Jewish Nation of the Caribbean, 2002, brings us closer to the North American colonies. He notes that as the Conversos moved away from Iberia, they formed concentrations initially in nearby Spanish possessions such as Madeira, the Azores, and the Canaries. So first they set up shop there. Remember, Madeira, they were learning and producing sugar. They have sugar plantations, one of the best in the world. In these islands, the Sephardic Jews and Moors. Thus, one clue to the Sephardic ancestry of North American colonists would be trading ties to these places. Conversos also congregated in the French cities of Bordeaux, Bayonne, and Rouen. All right, all those were Sephardic cities. Arbel devotes specific chapters in his book to Barbados, Belize, Berbice, Colombia, Costa Rica, Curacao, the Danish West Indies, Demerara, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Essequibo, Guyana or Cayenne, Haiti, Honduras, Jamaica, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, Nevis, Panama, Pomeroon, and Suriname. Elias Asmal was governor here. Saint Eustatius, Tobago, Trinidad, Tucacas, and Venezuela. All right, all those places. He has specific, they're saying that this guy has specific info on these places where the Sephardic went and held up, created their colonies and everything. It says here, Sephardim pioneered the rum, sugar cane, and orange juice industries. All right, they were running it. According to our bill, they were prominent in growing and refining coffee, cocoa, vanilla, indigo, vermilion, coconuts, and eggplant. Thus, when we encounter North American colonists engaged in these trades, we should view it as a possible sign of Sephardic ancestry. That's what I'm trying to tell you. When you think about the Spanish over here, or all this, you just think Jews and Muslims. Portuguese, this is what they're trying to tell you, especially when they're dealing with trade and ships going international, commerce. Our bill also stresses the Sephardic Jews consider themselves one community, nación, whether they openly practice their faith or were privately observant but publicly Protestant. All right? Privately Jews, but they were publicly Protestants or Catholic. All right? Huguenots. It was considered a distinct advantage to have relatives and friends on both sides of the fence, so to speak, to ensure security and protection from potential harassment or persecution. We shall see when we get to New York, and several prominent Christian families were in fact conversos, and that some members of these families married openly Jewish spouses. Continuing in this book, we're going to go to this part. It says Marcus series. All right, we read this again in the Huguenot video. Part of it, again, the Huguenot video is a 5-hour video, so we're not going to remember everything, right? So let's just refresh it, get it like it's the first time here, now that we're reading this book more thoroughly. It says, with its 3 large volumes, Jacob R. Marcus, the Colonial American Jew, 1492 to 1776, is the most substantial work on the Sephardic presence in British North America, all right? So you know what that means? That means I'm going to look for that book, and we're going to read that book too. Marcus traces the roots of American Jews to the important French crypto-Jewish Sephardic community, all right? Beginning about 1550. He emphasizes that many of the Iberian refugees publicly belonged to Huguenot, Walloon, or other Protestant denomination, all right? They were Huguenots, these crypto-Jews. He also acknowledges the crypto-Jewish and openly Jewish Sephardic communities in the Netherlands, which served as the seedbed for the large-scale return of the Jews to England, beginning about 1650, as well as for the foundation of the New York colony. As does Katz later, Marcus focuses attention on the underground Jewish community that flourished in England from the reign of Henry VIII. He suggests, as we noted in chapter 1, that Cristobal Colon was a converso Jew whose family resettled in Italy, and that not only Columbus navigated, but also 5 additional crew members were Jewish. Alonso de la Calle Marco, a physician who bore the same surname as Marcos himself, Mastre Bernal, a physician, Rodrigo Sanchez de Segovia, the controller, and Luis de Torres, the interpreter. All right, we've got this already. Before he spoke Hebrew, they brought him to speak with the Indians. Sephardim in the New World had a wide variety of occupations and lived at all levels of the socioeconomic spectrum. According to Marcus, they were shoemakers, tailors, blacksmiths, tavern keepers, peddlers, mariners, masons, ship captains, factors, barkers, gold and silversmiths, butchers, tanners, physicians, notaries, mine and mill owners, merchants, candy manufacturers, slave dealers, all right? City mayors, priests, bishops, bankers, tax collectors, and provincial governors. Judaic religious traditions were usually observed in private. Worship services were held in the homes of anyone where a group would gather on Shabbat. Because no copies of the Torah were available, the secret Sephardim would use the biblical Old Testament and the Psalms, sometimes also books like Josephus' Ancient History of the Jews. So now I'm going to read from this book. It's from the American Jewish Archives. Sephardim in the Americas. Martin A. Cohen. Remember, John Calvin was a Cohen. It became Calvin, eventually Calvin, but it was a Cohen. Guest editor, it says. All right, this is the volume, the year, number 1. So continuing, it says here, Martinique, all right, another of the islands in the Caribbean. It says a few have received as refugees found their way to Martinique, where they were joined by Portuguese Jews from southwestern France. There was, see how they were just meeting up, like I said. They didn't just come from Brazil. They weren't just refugees from Brazil, all right? So again, these refugees, they were probably being called Dutch, and then these people were being called Portuguese. So then you forget that these are all Sephardic Moors. These are, again, tags, right? Letting you know they're meeting up. Encouraged by Colbert King Louis the 14th minister, the community grew. By 1676, was able to build a synagogue in the capital town of St. Pierre. That same year, Benjamin da Costa, the da Costa family, we know they were being labeled mulattoes in the States. A lot of them came through Ireland. They were like the Irish mulattoes. The Costas were actually Portuguese Jews. All right, they labeled mulattoes, people of color. Andrade, so Benjamin da Costa Andrade went to Amsterdam to acquire both a bride and a Torah scroll, which he brought back to the island. A 1680 census lists 80 Jews. A subsequent one 3 years later lists 96. But in 1685, the Jesuits who controlled trade in the French colonies took advantage of Colbert's loss of power to persuade the king to introduce the Code of Noir, or the Black Codes. That's deep right there. Wow, I didn't expect this one. So the Code of Noir was not because of Africans or any people they were calling so-called black. It was mainly because who was there? Who was there before the Jesuits? Who wanted to get... They did that because of the Jews that were there. All right? They did it because of the Sephardic, Moorish people of color that were numerous in this island of Martinique. So the Jesuits, again, persuaded the king to introduce the Code of Noir, the Black Code, banishing all Jews from French colonies, the Black Code. These same Black Codes was the same ones they went and brought up to North America, same Black Codes. These were for the Jews, so-called Jews, people of color, Black Codes, to get rid of them, banish them from the French colony, the Black Code. That's a major one right there. Man, the majority of them left for Curaçao. Any surviving traces of this short-lived community disappeared when St. Pierre was wiped out in the eruption of Mount Pelée in 1902. The history was erased. What happened? Who was the Black Codes for? All right, and now we got Haiti. In 1697, Spain ceded the western third of the island Columbus had named Hispaniola to the French. They restored its Indian name, Ayatí. Under Spanish rule, Marranos were to be found on the northern coast at Isabela. There was Marranos there, despite France's Black Code. Despite the Black Code prohibiting Jewish settlement, there are indications of Jews doing business with almost every port on the island during the 17th and 18th centuries. Again, this Black Codes that France put on not only in Martinique, but also in Haiti and all their territories, it was basically targeted to the Sephardic Jews and Moors. These Black Codes. All right. The Gardis and Mendes families of Bordeaux maintained trade depots after the 1750s. A tax list dated January 16, 1765 shows 29 Jewish heads of families in Cap Haitian plus 8 others as either plantation owners or widely scattered areas. Cap Haitian undoubtedly had a congregation and cemetery, but the Black Uprising of 1790 slaughtered or scattered Haiti's white population. All right, so again, they want us to think in this journal, American Jews Heart, because all the Jews they've been talking about, these Marranos and all this stuff, like we don't know what Marranos mean, are white people. All right, so it's not a black and white world like they want us to picture it, or war in this time. This uprising. The majority of the surviving Jews migrated to other islands or to the North American mainland. All right, so we know that Sephardic Jews and the also the Moors, crypto Jews or Moriscos, Marranos, whatever you want to call them. They got taken out of Spain and Portugal. They had to they had to either convert, stop their religious practices, or die or leave, right? So a lot of them, a lot of these people,
Moors and Sephardic Jews, a lot of them were the same. A lot of them were both, ended up in other parts of Europe. France is one of them. So it says here the Sephardic Jews of Bordeaux, assimilation and emancipation in revolutionary and Napoleonic France. Assimilation where? In France. And it says here the establishment, this is chapter 1. It says the establishment of the Portuguese nation in southwestern France. Portuguese, right? Iberians. From the splendor of the courts of medieval Muslim Spain, right? We just read about them, right? To the war-weary port of the city of Bordeaux. Represents a long and eventful journey filled with conversion, expulsion, and the unrelenting threat of the Inquisition. What led the Marranos of Spain? Remember what a Marrano is. So what led the Marranos of Spain in Portugal to Bordeaux? How? Despite the fact that France had expelled her Jews in 1394 and showed no intention of reversing that decision, were they able to establish a Jewish community, which by the eve of revolution was intellectually enlightened, economically prosperous, and socially and politically prepared to enter the emerging nation state. It is these questions which will occupy us as we trace the early development of the Bordeaux community. For a few centuries there had existed in medieval Muslim Spain a dynamic rapport between the Jews and their Arab and Christian neighbors. A dynamic rapport, all right? This rapport minimized the restricting impulses of separate theologies and elicited an intellectual, poetic, and commercial efflorescence. As the Spanish Umayyad Caliphate gave way to the fanatical Berber dynasties, however, Jews were increasingly persecuted. Many left southern Spain for areas in the north recently reconquered by the Spanish Christians. There they reestablished their prestige and influence. Political instability, Catholic zeal, and examples set by the Christians of Europe soon undermined the security of the Jewish communities. In 1391, persecutions and massacres spread throughout Christian Spain, creating in their wake converts to Christianity known as New Christians or Conversos, right? Converting a lot of these Sephardic Jews and Muslims. These Muslims, Marranos, these converted, they were converts. They were secretly Muslims still, though. These former Jews, many although not all of whom retained their commitment to Judaism, saw their numbers increase with the persecutions of 1411. No longer protected as infidels, these new Christians were soon subjected to the punishments reserved for heretics. In 1492, again, same year that Columbus and his goons came over here, right? Ferdinand and Isabella completed their reconquista with the defeat of the only surviving Muslim stronghold of Granada and the expulsion of all Muslims and Jews, all Muslims together. Why together? They were living, coexisting together, mixing together already for a couple, 100 years. Unable to resign the decree of March 30, the Jews of Spain were required to convert or emigrate. Convert or die. While some converted, others made their way to Portugal, where Emmanuel, unwilling to deprive his realm of needed middle class, forcibly baptized the entire community. He forcibly told them, all right, you guys want to come live here in Portugal, you got to baptize. Most likely to Christianity. By the middle of the 16th century, both Spain and Portugal, united in 1580, had cleansed their realm of the Jews. They were confronted, however, with a large and increasingly influential community of new Christians, derisively labeled Marranos, all because these were all converts of Muslims and Jews. Throughout the following centuries, the Inquisition would seek to ferret out those among these converts who were suspected of Judaism. The social climate of Bordeaux and its unique potential for commercial growth were such as to provide a receptive environment for those fleeing the arms of the Inquisition. Again, so all these, right, Muslim Moors, these Jewish Sephardic Jews were fleeing to France, Bordeaux. All right, so just real quick, it says here, Marrano and Spanish swine used despairingly by both Spanish and Portuguese to designate those Jews who had converted to Christianity, but who were suspected of remaining faithful to Judaism. All right, so Marranos, Judaism, and Morisco is for Moors. Moors who converted to Christianity was Moriscos.
We're going to go back again. We're just going over information we've gone over before. All right. History of the conquest of Spain by the Arab Moors. with a sketch of the civilization which they achieved and imparted to Europe by Henry Copey in 2 volumes, volume 2, 1892. And we go to page 445. And again, it breaks down Christopher Columbus' name, the Christ bearer, right? That's not his name. What's his name? Salvador Fernandez Sarco, maybe, possibly. All right, we're digging on that. And it's talking about how he brought evil to the Aborigines and that he only thought Moorish civilization was good. All right, and that he left from a Moorish port. All right, and that many of his sailors were Moorish blood in their veins. It has been asserted that when the Moors were driven out, thousands took refuge in south of France, who afterwards, abhorring the Roman Catholic persecutions, became Huguenots, and that of these many emigrated at a later date to South Carolina. Charlestown, a city of free people of color, right? Huguenots are who? Moorish, are Moors Swarthy, are more so-called black, are more so-called Negro, let's be straight up. Or in this case, Kurimeo, can more mean white in this case? No, sorry, more does not mean white. Not in this case. All right, so again, Huguenots, right? We're going over information here. Let's not forget that. Huguenots, again, or Moors. All right, Huguenots, Moors. All right, so whenever you hear Huguenot, whenever today I'm reading Huguenot, you think Moors, because that's what they were, Moors.
So remember that there was a lot of European indentured servants coming over here. So we read this book in my video of Abraham Lincoln, where it told us that his mom possibly is Melungeon, and there's a lot of history behind that. Now it says here, Melungeons, the last lost tribe in America. All right, who's the Melungeons? Elizabeth Caldwell Hirschman, a Northburn Kennedy Service editor. And I'm on page 61 of this book, and it says here, now we must supplement the historical record with some additional and significant information. Major Abram Wood was part of a large Sephardic family, which had arrived early in the colonies and by the early 1600s was placed in South Carolina, and by the latter 1600s had also found its way to Maryland. So I believe South Carolina was actually a major place where Huguenots, French Huguenots, arrived. All right, remember French Huguenots had some kind of relation with all these Sephardic Jews and Moorish Moriscos, and then up in France. Further, we must also know that Governor Spottswood himself was born in Morocco and was likely familiar with Sephardic and Moorish emigres from the Mediterranean to the New World. Spottswood's probable intent in traveling to the Blue Ridge Mountains was not merely to claim this territory for England, which had already been done, but rather to search for silver mines reputed to have been abandoned by the early Spanish colonists from Santa Elena. Thickening the matter further is the fact that Germania, colony at which he stopped and took on men and supplies, does not appear to have been settled by ethnic Germans, but rather Sephardic Jews. Germania, remember Ashkenaz, these people are all mixing, same people, Turkish tribes from Holland and Bohemia, who were specifically recruited by Spottswood for their mining and metallurgical expertise. Sephardic Jews from Germania, a colony of Germans, not from Germans, but Sephardic Jews. We should also bear in mind that the Spanish were still actively present in Florida, Louisiana, and other parts of the Southeast during this time period, and further that they and the English were hardly alone on the continent. Further down in the book, it says in 1754, 1755, and 1756, the French and Indians, who's these French, attacked colonial settlements in southwestern Virginia near New River, Reed Creek, and Holston River. A list of those killed, wounded, or taken prisoner has been preserved and is given below. All right, so they have a list of the names of these people. All right, pay attention to what they're going to say. It is instructive in that we see on it not only Scotch, Irish, and English names, but also those whose name would seem to indicate Jewish or what? Moorish, Melungeon ancestry. Moorish, what? Melungeon, Moorish, Melungeon ancestry, Jewish. All right. So this is the list. It starts right here. Adam Benjamin, John Cook, Lynn. They're saying these are Jewish Moors, so some of these Welshire. So look, Dutch Jacob, that's Frederick Stern, Benjamin Davis, Isaac Freeland, Lieutenant Wright, Colonel James Patton, Barrier, Draper, Cole, Leonard Griffin, Looney, Lee, Mudd, Smith, Mann, Harmon, Moses, John Smith, Looney, Bratton, Smith, Pepper, Medley, Lyon, Goodman, Harrison, Berg, Baker, Stallnaker, Hidden, Stallnaker, Cooney, Hawk, McFarlane, Benchman. All right, that was a long list. So it says also settled in the area at the time were Peter Matthias, Adam David, Jacob and Henry Harmon, William and Richard Hall, Haley Tobias, Philip and Joseph Clapp, Benjamin Angel, David Curry, Richard Hines, James Lyons, Richard Paris, Nathaniel Gist, son of Christopher Gist, Joseph Martin, Alicia Walden, William Carr, William Cadbury, James Aldrich, Henry Skaggs, John Henry, Anthony Bledsoe, and John and Valentine Xavier, all I propose of Sephardic Moorish descent, all Sephardic Moorish descent. By the 1770s, they had been joined by Robert and James Davis, Alexander Willie, Hugh Gallion, John Berry, Andrew Charles, John Lewis, Lieutenant Goldman, and by June 1770, nearly Moore's Fort had the following troops. List of the troops at Forts Moore, right? So there's a list of all these names. It says down here on 22 July 1776, Virginia organized a battalion of soldiers from the southwestern portion of the state to battle the Cherokee Indians. Among these soldiers, as listed below, are several I propose to be a Sephardic, right? Sephardic, look how they wrote it, Sephardic Moorish descent. Who? Soldiers fighting who? Cherokee Indians, right? Your ancestors. Who was fighting them? Well, people who were Sephardic or Moorish descent. And look at the names. Oh, we got one of them, John Adair. All right, so these are some names of what he's saying are Sephardic or Moorish. And what I want to show you is on the footnote of this, it says right here, the reader is requested to compare the names on the following two lists with the list of Sephardic surnames available at, and this is the website. Make sure you go to this website. It's www.sephardim.com if you want to check the last names. So you can see what she's saying. And there's more last names here. She's saying a lot of these are Sephardic or Moorish last names. So that's what I was saying earlier. Who really, was coming to America? We got to really think about all these indentured servants. Are they all, just because they're European, are they all pale skin? Are they all just what we think of white, pale, Caucasian? No. A lot of these Europeans were Muslims. A lot of these Europeans were Jewish, Sephardic Jews, and all kinds of different people. And the list, this is a long list. It says, from comparing these settler lists with lists of documented Sephardic surnames, it is apparent that several persons of Sephardic Moorish ancestry are present at this time. Contemporaneous with these settlers was Daniel Boone. Oh, the famous Daniel Boone. They said he was colored, right? Boone, America's archetypic pioneer. Boone had learned of Kentucky and the Cumberland Gap, leading it to during the French and Indian War. Just want to go to the footnote. It says 14. Remember, it says it is apparent several persons of Sephardic Moorish ancestry are present at this time. Footnote 14. It says even John Xavier and his brother Valentin were of Moorish descent. The family Xavier or Javier, right? That's how we say in Spanish, Xavier, having fled to France during the Inquisition. They're Moors who fled to France. If we're talking about Moors, who they are, Moorish, those nations behind that name. If you hear about Sephardic, now that you understand that, where that comes from and all the sub-ethnic groups that might be involved, even in the word Moorish, right? Because a lot of the Berber Moors are pale skin, basically ancient Georgian Iberians, a lot of them coming from Georgia. Remember this idea of Moorish or Moors leaving Spain, Portugal, ending up in France during the Inquisition. And from there, what happened to them after they got to France? What happened to them? One last thing in this book, I just want to read here. It says, one other early families living at Fort Blackmore was Samuel Alley and his daughter Polly, who was captured by Indians but later escaped. When reading through these historical events, I was suddenly struck by the names returned to the listing of Sephardic and Moorish surnames. Again, Sephardic and Moorish together, and discovered that with the exception of John Carter and Harry Innes, most of the other settlers appeared to be of Sephardic Moorish descent. All right, that's 16. And it says 16. Volumes 1-9 of Colonial Families of the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Westminster, Maryland Family Line Publication says were examined for Sephardic, Moorish, and or Melungeon first names and surnames. Inspection of genealogy suggested that of the following families were of Sephardic Moorish descent. Numbers in parentheses following family names are pasted. So these are the names and last names, all right? I just want you to show the footnote. There's actually a whole study on this. And you can see the list of names, and it goes on. Look how big it is. All right. So it's a list of following families, which I found to have predominantly Sephardic, Moorish, Melungeon first names. Addington, Bryson Borough. All right. Keeps going. The Washington County, Virginia, and all these lists. And going back here, it says, indeed, in his History of Scott County, Virginia, 1932, Addington comments that the original spellings of Blackmore and Ali were Blackamore or Blackmore, and Ali or Ali. By 1776, a Samuel Cohen had arrived with his family, and by 1794 they had been joined by James John and Peter Van Berber, Vincent Job and Abraham Hobbs, Adam Eli and George Joachim. By 1783, Daniel and Manassas Frio had opened a dry goods store in Abington, Virginia, and by 1784, Joseph Gibbs, Samuel Ware, Ashwell Rollins, Andrew Greer, Valentine Sevier, and Archibald Stone had settled in Jonesboro, Tennessee. In essence, a small Sephardic Moorish Melungeon community had formed in the midst of the Appalachian wilderness. Sephardic Moors, Blackamore is Blackmore, Blackamore. All right, just want to correlate it real quick because I found this in this book. Just read a little bit. It's called Appalachian Folkways by John B. Reeder. And it says here, who are the Melungeons? Possible origins of the term Melungeon are interesting yet confusing. The French word mélanger means mixed or blended. The Greek melas means dark or black. The African Portuguese melungo or melango means shipmate. All right, shipmate. The Turkish terms melan and khan, which together sound like melungeon, translate as damned fool. Several colorful theories surround the Melungeon origins, but the most plausible traces Melungeons to the dark-skinned peoples of North Africa and Iberia, Spain, and Portugal, and possibly Turkey. Brent Kennedy, who is a Melungeon and a contemporary expert on the subject, discovered his own genetic connection to the Mediterranean through a rare illness, erythema nodosum sarcoidosis, that he contracted in 1988. Kennedy's ensuing field and documentary research pointed to Mediterranean Moors, Turks, Berbers, and Iberians. If we accept that Melungeons came from the Mediterranean stock, how did they arrive in Appalachia so early before 1700? Kennedy distills his thoughts. I contend that the remnants of João Juan Pardo's forts, joined by the Portuguese refugees from Santa Elena, and possibly a few stray Dominicans and Jesuits, exiled Moorish French Huguenots, again, exiled Moorish French Huguenots, and escaped Acadians, along with Drakes and perhaps other freed Turkish, Moorish, and Iberian captives survived on these shores. Combined forces over the ensuing years moved to the hinterlands, intermarried with various Carolina and Virginia Native Americans, and eventually became the reclusive Melungeons. I as strongly contend that the Turkish Moorish element was, at least in the beginning, the predominant one, explaining why the probable Turkish self-descriptive term Melungeon came to be associated with various populations regardless of their location. All right, so remember that we learned that possibly that Abraham Lincoln's mom, who was very dark-skinned, and him himself, who was dark-skinned, right, she might have been Melungeon. We learned that, right? So this book saying, you know, Melungeons are basically these people who basically mix with native people over here, and we already